On a cold summer night in 1942, USS Washington and her crew prepared for what would be the longest night of their lives. Thousands of Japanese aircraft filled the skies over the island of Guadalcanal. The Allies were surrounded, and defeat seemed inevitable. But one battleship stood tall throughout the fight, defeating Japanese troops and sinking their best ships, while taking no hits at all. How did the USS Washington manage to escape the entire war without any casualties or damage? How did she become one of the most famous Navy ships in American history? Join us as we take a trip back in time to uncover the story of the one battleship shot that prevented America's massive defeat. The battleship that saved America. The USS Washington was a war machine unlike anything America has ever seen. It holds the record for the most battleships sunk. And surprisingly, it remained untouched throughout the war. To understand how this battleship became so iconic, we must go to the very beginning. The story of the USS Washington began on June 14, 1938, when its keel was laid at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. As a flagship vessel of the United States Navy during World War II, the USS Washington design was based on the Washington Naval Treaty. Signed in 1922, this five-power treaty was drafted by all major allies of World War I. The goal was to prevent a competition for military superiority between the nations. It limited the construction of battleships, battle cruisers, and aircraft carriers between these allies. During the process of designing the vessel, the General Board had a couple of designs to consider. Among the options, some could go 26 miles per hour. However, others were standard fast battleships. Eventually, they selected a fast battleship armed with 12 14-inch guns. Even though this wasn't going to be enough armory for a battleship of that size, the United States had to respect the treaty. But there was one clause that gave room for manipulation. You see, these nations were allowed to break the rules if any member nation failed to sign the treaty. Japan refused to comply, and they continued to build bigger and bigger warships. So the United States invoked what's known as the escalator clause. This allowed them to increase the gun size to 16 inches. As for the battleship itself, it was a little over 728 feet long. Its beam measured around 108 feet and 4 inches. Its draft measures 32 feet and 11.5 inches in length. On a regular non-combat day, the standard displacement was about 35,000 long tons. But at full combat load, it increased to 44,800 long tons. Under the hood, the ship was powered by 4 steam turbines, built by General Electric. Producing 121,000 shaft horsepower, the turbines pushed the USS Washington to a top speed of 28 knots, or 32 miles per hour. Its cruising range was about 17,450 nautical miles at a speed of 15 knots. For aerial reconnaissance, the USS Washington relied on 3 Vought OS-2U Kingfisher float planes. Before its activation, Washington operated with a crew of 1,800 officers and enlisted men. But in times of war, the crew grew to 99 officers and 2,035 enlisted men. As for the firepower, the USS Washington was armed with 3 batteries. The main battery consisted of 9 16-inch Mark VI guns, all of which were arranged in 3 triple-gun turrets on the center line. The secondary battery consisted of 25-inch dual-purpose guns. This artillery was mounted in twin turrets with 5 on either side of the ship. It was also equipped with an anti-aircraft battery of 16 1.1-inch guns. This was in addition to 1850 caliber M2 Browning machine guns. However, this capacity would eventually increase during the ship's lifetime. As powerful as the USS Washington was, though, it had a little weakness in its armory. The main armored belt was 12 inches thick, while the main armored deck was only about 5.5 inches thick. The layout of the armor was designed to protect it against 14-inch guns. However, since the treaty was dismissed, it meant that the armory could be increased even further. Unfortunately, though, it was too late to go back to the drawing table. So the designers just went on with what they had already. But despite this weakness, the USS Washington became one of the most successful battleships in U.S. history, the Atlantic operations. On June 1, 1940, the complete hull of the battleship was launched. This was after 2 full years of development. By May 15, 1941, the fitting out work was also completed. Finally, the ship could be officially commissioned into the fleet. Proper seal trials began on August 3rd, but then the builders discovered a problem. Due to the use of 3-bladed screws, the ship suffered from excessive vibration when running at high speed. To counter this problem, the shipbuilders did the same thing they did with the North Carolina. 2 4-bladed screws were added on the outer shafts. In addition, 2 5-bladed propellers were also added to the inboard shafts. However, throughout this testing process, the United States was still neutral during World War II. But even though it was not in active service just yet, the USS Washington trained with other vessels. This included the famed North Carolina and the aircraft carrier Wasp, all of which were part of the Atlantic Fleet. Everything changed in 1942 when the Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor. America could no longer stand on the sidelines and watch the war unfold. This, coupled with Germany's declaration of war, meant that it was time for the USS Washington to see some action. This marked the beginning of the Atlantic operation, a mission that tested the tenacity of both the ship and its crew. Since the United States was now officially at war, the USS Washington was assigned as the flagship of Task Force 39. Under the command of Rear Admiral John Wilcox, Jr., the battleship left for Britain on the 26th of March. Apart from Washington, other members of the unit included the heavy cruisers Wichita and Tuscaloosa, as well as the vessel Wasp. Task Force 39's mission was simple: provide support for the British Home Fleet based in Scapa Flow, which had been weakened during the fighting. As part of the invasion of Madagascar, the Home Fleet had to detach its units. So the goal was for the American Battle Group to help counter the German battleship Tirpitz, as well as other threats in occupied Norway. But while on its way to the designated point, Washington experienced its first tragedy. Man overboard, the death of the admiral. When sailing on the high seas, getting thrown overboard is probably one of the most terrifying experiences for any Navy personnel. Unfortunately, this was the fate of John Wilcox, Jr., the brave admiral who captained both the ship and the unit. In the early hours of March 27, 1942, a chilling event occurred on the USS Washington, and to this day, the mystery remains unsolved. No one really saw him vanish from the ship. But Lieutenant William Fargo was outside that day, and as the officer on the deck, he was out on surveillance duty when tragedy struck. The weather was extremely cold. Snowfall clouded the skies, and the water was almost freezing. Even the barrels of the 16-inch guns were glazed with ice, while the ship was slammed on both sides by icy water. Suddenly, the faint cry of the ship's lookout could be heard. "Man overboard!" he screamed. According to the ship's log, he had seen a man in the water, although it was hard to tell who exactly it was. Since Washington and the other ships in the unit were under radio silence, Captain H.J. Benson ordered that the message be sent to the other ships using whistles and flags. 2 destroyers moved toward the flagship. The cruiser Tuscaloosa also signaled that a man was in the water. He was swimming toward a life ring, but the water was cold, and it didn't look like he would make it. A few moments later, the destroyer Livermore sent in its own report. A man had been spotted floating face down in the terrifying sea. No one could rescue him, or at least recover his body, and everyone had to watch on helplessly. However, one question that remained unanswered was, who was the man who fell overboard? Immediately, all 2,000 men on the USS Washington were assembled for a roll call. Every officer and seaman was identified, and no one appeared to be missing. But at least 6 officers had seen the man floating in the water. So, who could it be? To solve this mystery, Captain Benson ordered another roll call. This time, the officers were required to cite every man as his name was called. Once again, no one was found missing. The task force continued to search the waters, but the man was long gone, swallowed by the raging sea. Since all of the men were accounted for, Captain Benson had no choice but to order that the report be submitted to the Admiral's cabin. This was where the situation became clear. As the Marine sentry on duty tried to open the door, he found the cabin empty. The whole ship was searched through and through, but the Admiral was nowhere to be found. At first, the men didn't want to believe the obvious implication of this, but after considering every angle of the situation, the truth was undeniable. The man overboard was Admiral Wilcox himself. He was also the only man not included in the ship's registry. In addition, several of his men claimed to have seen him on the deck. They mentioned how he looked pale and acted confused as he moved around the ship. Some claimed he probably suffered a heart attack. Others believed he suffered from seasickness and became weak. But whatever the cause may have been, Admiral Wilcox remains the only U.S. admiral to ever be lost overboard at sea. But while the death of this one man was memorable, the USS Washington was about to experience another major tragedy. This time, the entire battleship almost ended up at the bottom of the ocean. Trouble on the high seas, the tragedy of the HMS Punjabi. May 1st, 1942, started out as an ordinary day. The waters of the North Atlantic were unusually calm, but unknown to everyone. A huge tragedy lurked around the corner. The British destroyer, HMS Punjabi, was sailing the high seas that day. Its mission: to protect supply vessels carrying food and ammunition between the Allied nations. Traveling alongside the vessel was the HMS King George V, the carrier HMS Victoria, and of course, the USS Washington. Because of how huge the ships in the fleets were, turning and maneuvering was a dangerous task. Each ship had to communicate with the rest of the fleet before making the slightest movement. At around 3:45 p.m., King George V found herself in a dangerous situation while trying to avoid hitting another ship in the convoy, known as the Inglefield. At the same time, the Punjabi was also forced to change its course to avoid a landmine. This turned out to be a recipe for disaster. Unfortunately, both ships immediately collided, and the Punjabi was split into two pieces. The impact was so severe that the men aboard both ships believed they had been hit by a torpedo. But when they looked around and saw no enemy, they realized the damage was inflicted by one of their own. Seeing that the Punjabi was definitely going down, other ships started deploying life rafts to save as many as possible. Of all the 250 men on board, 206 were saved, while others perished. But that's not where the story ends. As the whole situation unfolded, the USS Washington was following the two vessels way too closely. Due to its size and the number of ships on the water, maneuvering out of the way of the wreckage was impossible, so it had to keep going. As Washington passed over the sinking destroyer, the Punjabi's depth charges exploded. Since the battleship was right above the impact spot, the shock damaged some of its radars and fire control equipment. There was also a small leak in the fuel tank, which at first looked like it could escalate the situation. But thankfully, the damage was easily contained by the personnel, and further harm was avoided. While King George V was forced to return to the port for repairs, USS Washington and the other vessels remained at sea before heading out to complete a new mission in the Pacific. Pacific Operations, the Guadalcanal Campaign. After stopping over in New York for a refit, Washington and her crew set out for the Pacific on August 23rd. Escorted by 3 destroyers, the battleship passed through the Panama Canal on August 28th. On September 14th, it finally arrived in Nuku'alofa in Tonga. Upon her arrival, Washington became the flagship of Rear Admiral Willis Lee. Lee was the commander of Battle Division 6 and Task Group 12.2 at the time, and the battleship was about to play a major role in one of his most important missions. On September 15th, Washington sailed to meet with the ships of Task Force 17, which was headed by the aircraft carrier Hornet. Both ships would later operate together during a mission to support the campaign in the Solomon Islands. While working out of their base in Noumea and Espiritu Santo in New Hebrides, they provided protection for convoys bringing in supplies and reinforcements to the Marines fighting on Guadalcanal. It was during one of these convoy operations that the infamous Battle of Cape Esperance took place. Although Washington and the other vessels in its fleet were too far away to actually participate in the battle, the distant support they provided proved to be very valuable. Not long after this mission was concluded, Washington was transferred to Task Force 64. This was where the real action began. In addition to the USS Washington, the unit also included 1 heavy and 2 light cruisers, as well as 6 destroyers. Between October 21st to 24th, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft tried to approach the area, so they started attacking the task force. On October 27th, I-15, a Japanese submarine tried to torpedo USS Washington, but luckily, it missed, and the battleship remained unharmed. However, the U.S. fleet was going down fast. By early November, the carriers Wasp and Hornet were at the bottom of the ocean. The only surviving vessels were the Enterprise, Washington, and the new battleship South Dakota. Washington was then transferred to Task Force 16. There, it once again joined forces with heavy cruiser Northampton and 9 destroyers. On November 11th, the ships headed out to the Guadalcanal to continue the fighting. The following day, they were joined by the cruiser Pensacola and 2 more destroyers. On November 13th, the crew got intel that the Japanese were coming with heavy fire. To prepare for the battle, Washington, South Dakota, and 4 destroyers were separated from the fleet and designated as Task Force 16.3. But there was a little problem. You see, because the American task force just got assembled days before the attack, they had no experience working together on the battlefield. Both Washington and South Dakota also had very limited experience shooting their main battery, especially at nighttime. This would eventually affect them greatly once fighting started. Around 11 p.m. on November 14th, Washington's search radar detected a Japanese cruiser and a destroyer around the area, and it opened fire with the main battery. South Dakota joined in shortly after, firing star shells to illuminate the targets. One of the Japanese destroyers, Ayanami, also opened fire on the American destroyer. This exposed her position to the USS Washington. Seizing the chance to attack, Washington concentrated its heavy artillery on the vessel. Before long, her propulsion machinery was destroyed, causing a major fire. But while Washington was making significant progress on the battlefield, South Dakota wasn't doing so well. At around 11:30, an error in the electrical switchboard knocked out the power on the vessel. The radar system was disabled, and the ship was practically blind to the Japanese vessels. Things were not going well for the American fleets at this point. 2 destroyers had been torpedoed. 1 survived, the other sank, and a 3rd was destroyed by gunfire. At this point, the USS Washington was essentially on her own on the battlefield. The only advantage was that the Japanese squadron didn't know where exactly she was. To protect their location, Captain Glenn B. Davis kept the battleship on the disengaged side of the flaming wreckage. However, South Dakota was forced to turn in front of the burning destroyers to avoid a collision. The fire illuminated the ship, and the Japanese began a fresh attack. This allowed Washington to also engage the enemy without drawing fire to itself. A little damage was done, but the battle was far from over. Around 11:35 midnight, the SG radar on Washington's finally detected the main Japanese forces. Shortly afterwards, South Dakota's power was restored. This way, it was also able to pick up Japanese ships on its radar, less than 3 nautical miles away. Just 2 minutes later, Atago, the leading ship in the Japanese fleet, turned its searchlights on South Dakota, revealing its position. Immediately, the Japanese line opened fire, striking the battleship 27 times. Washington was still undetected at this point, so she opened fire on Atago. Washington was able to hit the vessel 9 times with its 16-inch weaponry and 40 times with its 5-inch gun. The damage on the Otago was grievous, but it wasn't going down just yet. Kirishima, another vessel in the Japanese fleet, also suffered serious damage. The area below the waterline was punctured with holes. Her forward 2 turrets were knocked out, and her rudders were jammed. Left with no choice, Kirishima was forced to steer in a circle to port. At this point, Washington then shifted fire to Otago and Takao, but it failed to score any significant hits on the vessels. However, the heavy attack convinced them to turn off their searchlights and reverse course. Their new strategy? Launch the torpedoes. As the battle became more heated after midnight, the 2 cruisers fired a total of 16 long-lance torpedoes at Washington. Luckily for the battleship, though, they all missed, every single one of them. By 12:20 a.m., Captain Lee turned the battleship to close with Kondo's cruisers, while Otago and Takao briefly engaged with their main batteries and even launched 3 more torpedoes. Washington sustained no damage in the attack. As for the enemy fleets, Kirishima burned, capsized, and sank. Ayanami was abandoned by its crew and sank, and the rest had to disengage after failing to strike Washington. South Dakota and the destroyers Benham and Gwin managed to withdraw from the area, and although it wasn't a resounding victory, Washington was able to sail away with her head high that day. More wartime adventures. Upon its return from this mission, USS Washington remained in the South Pacific for a while. That was until April 30th, 1943, when she finally departed from Noumea to Pearl Harbor. While on her way, she joined the fleet of Task Force 16, and together they arrived at the base on May 8th. Washington continued to operate as the flagship of Task Force 60 for the next 20 days. Together, the team conducted combat training off the coast of Hawaii. But by May 28th, this phase was over. As she prepared for more wartime adventures, Washington moved to the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard. The war ahead was bloody, so the ship needed to undergo some repairs and install new equipment. New screws were installed to solve the vibration problems, among other things. Once this was completed, she resumed training exercises in the base until July 27th, when it was time to sail again. This time, Washington was attached to Task Group 56.14, which moved alongside a convoy. The destination was Havana Harbor at Efate in the New Hebrides. The battleship would eventually spend the next 2 months conducting tactical training with the carrier task forces at this base. This was to prepare them for an upcoming campaign in the Central Pacific. The training extended until November 5th, when the task group finally dispersed. Washington, ready for new action, left for her new assignment in the Fiji Islands. While still under the command of Rear Admiral Lee, Washington sortied on November 11. The iconic ship was accompanied by ships from the Bat Divisions 8 and 9. The fleet traveled on to the Gilbert Islands, where Marine forces prepared to land on Tarawa. On November 19th, the carriers of Task Force 50 launched their first strikes. The skies were lit up, and the bombardment continued until the next day. This gave the Marines enough cover to move ashore on Tarawa and Makin. The onslaught of attack continued until November 25th. This was when Task Force 50 was finally reorganized. Washington was transferred to Task Group 50.4, along with carriers Bunker Hill and Monterey. The group also consisted of a familiar face, South Dakota. Alongside this old friend was also another vessel, Alabama. Between November 26th and 28th, the carrier groups operated out of the island of Makin. Their mission was to provide cover for the landing of troops and supplies on the island. On November 27th and 28th, Japanese aircraft launched an attack on the island. However, they were only able to inflict little damage. Fast forward to February 1st, and the battleship suffered its first major damage. While patrolling off the island of Guadalcanal on February 1st, 1944, Washington was involved in a terrible collision with the vessel Indiana. Indiana was trying to cut in front of Washington on its way to refuel a group of destroyers. In its hurried state, it rammed into Washington, causing significant damage to the ship. The entire bow on the battleship collapsed immediately. As for Indiana, it also lost about 200 feet of the plating on her hull. The two vessels were immediately withdrawn to Majuro to receive temporary repairs, though. Before long, Washington's crumpled bow was reinforced to allow her to travel to Pearl Harbor for further repairs. Then, on to Puget Sound Navy Yard in Bremerton, Washington, for even more repairs. It took until April before the repairs were completed, and Washington was finally able to return to active service. Upon her return to Pearl Harbor, the battleship resumed her role as the flagship of Willis Lee, who was now a vice admiral. From then on, the battleship then moved to begin the assault on the Mariana Islands. While on this mission, it struck targets on Saipan, Tinian, Guam, Rota, and Pagan. This helped to weaken the Japanese defenses before ground forces invaded the territories. The battleship also played a major role in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. On the 18th of June, 1944, Washington and other battleships were deployed to block the Japanese path of approach. As the Japanese aircraft flew over the American defenses, Washington was one of the first battleships to open fire. During the battle, the U.S. fleet destroyed hundreds of Japanese carriers, while also destroying 3 carriers in the process. The battleship also participated in the raid of the Palau Islands on the 25th of July, before Washington, Indiana, Alabama, and Birmingham were released to proceed to Eniwetok, the invasion of the Philippines and Japanese islands. On October 6, 1944, Washington and the rest of Task Force 38 embarked on the raid to isolate the island of the Philippines. In their first main operation, they unleashed hell on Japanese air bases on the island of Okinawa. The next day, they headed out to the sea to refuel before taking part in the major raids on Formosa. As the fleet withdrew on the 15th of October, Japanese air forces launched a brutal attack on them. Thankfully, the battleships and carriers were able to defend themselves without sustaining too much damage. Then, there was the Battle of Leyte Gulf, or Operation Shogo 1, the landing on Luzon, the landing on Mindoro in western Philippines, and many more missions. Later, Washington also escorted carriers during attacks on the Japanese island of Honshu. The mission, this time around, was to disrupt any plans by Japanese air forces to interfere with the invasion of Iwo Jima. After leaving Iwo Jima, Washington bombarded Japanese positions in Okinawa. This was to prepare the ground for invading forces and provide easy access. She would eventually return to Pearl Harbor for a refit, where she sat until the war ended on September 2, 1945. Washington. After the war ended. After completing her refit in September, the USS Washington conducted sea trials. It would later participate in the Korean War before it was finally retired. The battleship remained in the Navy's inventory until June 1, 1960, when it was finally removed from the Naval Vessel Register. On May 24, 1961, its lifespan came to an end when it was sold for scrap. The glorious battleship was towed to the Lipset division of Luria Brothers, and there it was torn to 1,000 pieces. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.